My name is Eric Kars, and I'd like to welcome everyone to the Convergence Data Classification Community Group. The topic for today's presentation is Teamcenter Classification Best Practices. The presenter today will be Richard Turner, and the setup of this presentation will be a 15-minute presentation followed by a 15-minute Q&A. Also, this will be recorded and a video will be sent afterwards. Some of the key learning points covered in today's presentation includes 8 steps to prepare classification data, rules on data normalization, use of LOVs, exporting PLMXML files to Teamcenter, data cleanup process. And at this time, I would like to turn it over to Richard Turner.
Thank you, Eric. Before we get started, I just want to make a note of our association, or provide some context with our association with Siemens and Teamcenter classification. We are a PLM World partner. Matter of fact, we will be at, if anybody's interested, we'll be at the Detroit Regional User Group meeting this Thursday, and we will be giving a presentation around 2 o'clock on this same topic, so please come and visit us. We have a booth there as well, as a side note. We're also a member of the advisory board for PLM World. We are a Siemens partner. And lastly, we run the classification community group, which is today's meeting. So we'd like to welcome everybody. And as Eric noted, we'll be recording this, and we'll be distributing the recording. So don't feel like you have to take notes on every single one of the slides. I'm not going to be able to go through every single item in the slide, so you will get a recording and you'll see all of that when we distribute it after the meeting. To introduce Convergence Data, we've been in business for 18 years, focused primarily on parts classification in the aerospace industry, electronics industry, automotive industry, consumer product goods, and we started in oil and gas 18 years ago. What we do is we take a customer's data and we enrich it with attribute information and we normalize it. And what do we mean by data? It could be their purchase parts, it could be their design parts, MRO, service parts, products they're selling online. We work with different types of typically engineered items. Many times companies engage us in the context of a migration where they've got multiple businesses moving to a single ERP or a PLM. That is the perfect time to do parts classification, because as we all know, each of those businesses probably have the same ways or different ways of describing the same thing, and you just don't want to introduce duplicates into your ERP system. Why do you do classification? It helps with parts reuse. It mitigates parts proliferation. It helps supply chain with normalizing and rationalizing their direct material spend. So it benefits many functional organizations within a company, not just engineering. We have an 8-step process that we follow for Teamcenter classification, which I'll describe in this slide here. Step number 1 in the top left, we start with a customer's parts list. Not every single part is a candidate for classification, so typically we work out some criteria to determine what parts make the most sense for classification. Once we get that final parts list, we move on to step 2. We establish a data model. That could be mechanical parts, categories for mechanical parts, electrical parts, could be the raw materials. The data model will be very specific to the parts that they give us. Once we've created that category structure and we've provided all the attributes, we move on to the most difficult step in all the 8 steps, is the harvesting of the attribute data. That could be 10 to 20 attributes per part. And what we typically do is we get this information from either part specifications that our customer provides. We go out to preferred supplier websites to collect the information from supplier parts. We have different sources for gathering the data in step number 3. Once we've gathered all the data, we can normalize the data. We have a process called allowed values management, where we basically create the LOVs that go into Teamcenter. What that does is it allows us to normalize the data, so there's only one way of describing the same thing, like a material. As we all know, we've probably seen 5 different ways to describe the same material. We'll create a list of values and LOV lists so that there can only be one way. And then we will normalize the data against that list so that there are no exceptions. Then once we've done all that data normalization, we're in a position to validate the data, to make sure that the data is high quality. And we want to check to make sure all the required attributes don't have any null fields. that there's no exceptions to the allowed values list, that they're not incorrect values in the various fields. So we do that as part of the data validation process. Once the validations have been passed, we then go through the policy manager, which is another module we have to check to make sure we're adhering to all the rules in Teamcenter, which we'll talk about later in the presentation. There are several rules that you need to know about. We build those into our policy manager, we check those, and once we've cleared all of those, we're in a position to finally export the data model, all the item data, the categories, the attributes, the values to Teamcenter following our export manager. And then lastly, the data resides in the Teamcenter classification. That's your opportunity to check to make sure it works properly. You can see the data, the category structure, the attributes, the values, make sure they look good, that you can support all your search queries that you want to be able to do, and put you in a good position to achieve the data governance that you want to achieve. So what do we mean by a data model or a classification structure or a schema? It has many different names. Here's a simple example of one. You can see here on the top, very top of this, you see root, and underneath that parts, and these are all the major part categories. The first one that we have opened up here is the electrical components, and you can see underneath it has several different subcategories. And if you get about halfway down the screen, you see the passives are opened up, and you can see the various subcategories under passives. Then under resistors, you can see actual leaf class. You can actually see a leaf class, and one of them is highlighted, the fixed resistors. And then to the right are all the attributes for the fixed resistors. So this is a category structure on the left. Then you see an actual leaf class, which is highlighted as fixed resistors. And then to the right are all the attributes that are applied to that category. You can see there's string attributes, short and long descriptions, there's numeric attributes, there's Boolean attributes, there's all different types of attributes. And some of these attributes may reside higher up in the structure, and they may be on every single category, which has a blue arrow next to them, and others are just specific to that one category. Some important things to note: you try to use industry standard data models. Don't try to reinvent the wheel on data models that already exist. And if you're creating your own structure, be very careful you don't go too far. Many times we notice our clients forget to think about the type attribute, and they end up with a classification structure that's a little too deep. So you want to make sure you consider type, and that truly there should be a different attribute profile across the different categories. Otherwise, you need to consolidate. And then lastly, we recommend you focus on your purchase parts, or the parts you think you'd share the most across different businesses. Those should be the high priority parts for classification. And here's another example I want to share with you of data validations. So here we got a grid on a particular category, and you can see across the top there's attributes in red and black. The ones that are red are actually required attributes. They start with the long description, then the short description, followed by head type. And you can see down below there's some pink fields. So if you have a required attribute and you don't have any values, excuse me, that's called a null error. If you have null errors in Teamcenter and required attributes, you can't load the part in Teamcenter. So that's why you want to run a validation check to make sure that there are no null values, and you need to fill those. Otherwise, you'll have problems loading into Teamcenter. Then you see under head type, you've got values in there, but they're highlighted as errors. Well, those errors are LOV errors. Some of those values are not on the LOV list. That will be another problem for Teamcenter you need to resolve prior to loading the data, to make sure that those values are actually on the LOV list so that they load properly in the Teamcenter. And then, so there's various checks that you can do. You want to make sure that there are not string values in numeric fields. And if you don't have a value for a field and it's a required attribute, I would put in the value TBD for string or 0.0 for numeric. That way the part will load safely into Teamcenter. And if you have a required LOV list, you might want to add TBD to that list to cover any cases where you don't have a value on the list, and you can just to give you the ability to load it in the Teamcenter. So those are some things to consider as far as the validation goes for Teamcenter classification. Now we have some examples here on numeric data. Now, one of the things that Teamcenter can do very nicely is it can toggle between metric and Imperial numeric data. So on the left is basically a screw that all of its numeric values are shown up in millimeters. And you can see every single numeric value with a millimeter next to it. And that same screw you can toggle to Imperial, and it shows you the attribute values, the numeric attribute values in Imperial. So that's a nice feature within Teamcenter, is you can toggle between those two units of measure. So you want to make sure that you provide this information to Teamcenter so that it can actually process this toggle. And other things you need to think about when you're doing this that we've come across in the past is you want to make sure the precision and the scale is set up properly so that you can do this toggle. Precision is basically the decimals, and scale is the number of digits. So if those aren't configured properly, then the toggle won't work correctly. We also learned that the units of measure that you send to Teamcenter, you want to make sure that they're all in lowercase. If it's not in the right sentence case, your import could fail. And here's another use case on numeric data. This is like a category most people are familiar with, screws. And we've seen some of our customers put all their screws into one category. And what I mean by all their screws, they're Imperial screws and they're metric screws. And the only problem with doing that is some of these attributes that have a mixture of string and numeric data are not going to toggle properly. So if you look at the thread diameter in the top example, it has a thread diameter of 0.3125 for that one particular screw. But then down below, we're looking at a metric screw and the thread diameter is M4. So if you toggle on the M4 screw to between metric and Imperial, it's going to continue to say M4. So you might want to, in this case, set up a separate category called metric screws so that the data toggles properly between Imperial and metric. Just a kind of a best practice that we recommend you think about. We talked about LOVs. These are a list of values. So these are the drop-down lists that you see in Teamcenter. So you want to make sure that you have a clean set of data. And we have a tool called the Allow Values Manager that helps create these LOV lists. On the left are the approved LOVs, and you can see a couple examples like aluminum and brass. And on the right, we're looking at one particular category, or what we call the exceptions. So a couple of these values are not on the LOV list. So what you need to decide is, do we add these values to the LOV list, or are they actually incorrect and they need to be one of the values on the LOV list, and you need to just normalize that to that single standard. So that's basically what we're talking about when we're talking about LOVs. And there's different best practices for LOVs. One of the things we recommend is if you have a string attribute that's on every category like commodity codes, then you could set that LOV list up high in the structure, and then you can have it propagate or inherit to every single category down below. And that just makes it a lot easier to manage that LOV list. If you want to add additional values to that LOV list, it'll propagate to every single LOV list in the structure. Another thing to be leery of is there's a 63 character limit in Teamcenter for values. And so if you have more than 63 characters, it will truncate when you load it into Teamcenter. And you might end up creating duplicate values when that truncation process occurs. So you might want to make sure that you check the data at 63 characters to make sure that there are no values that are highly similar and might confuse the users. Another best practice that we highly recommend is you set up normalization rules. When you have your meetings with your team members on a weekly basis, we recommend you review these normalization rules. Every customer that we work on or every project we work on has different normalization rules. Some are specific to Teamcenter, and you always have those if it's a Teamcenter project. Others are just specific to our customers' requirements. I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but some of the things that you need to think of, like you can see the allowed values. Everyone knows that's a Teamcenter one. But say the rules on descriptions, we have one customer saying their short descriptions need to be 150, their long need to be 500. You might want to decide how to handle fractions. Some companies don't like to have, some of our customers don't like to have fractions. They like to have decimals so that they can do their analytics more easily. So you want to be careful how much fractions you use versus numeric data with units of measure. And in some examples, you may have some ranges on a few attributes, but not on all the other ones. So you might want to set that attribute up as numeric and only show one value so that you can get better searching capability. And then lastly, in your string values, you need to decide you're going to use all capital letters or sentence case. These are just some illustrative examples. It's not a complete list, but I recommend when you're meeting with your team on a weekly basis, you review this list and make sure everybody is working to this one list and add any additional rules that come up each week. Another thing I recommend in your weekly meetings is you have a checklist. So one of the things that we do and we recommend is we basically process the data commodity group by commodity group, and we have a checklist for each commodity group. And here's a 10-step classification checklist, an illustrative example that we can share with you today. Step number one is we work out with some of our customers. If we need to harvest a data model, we harvest it from approved sources. So we let them know what source we obtained the data model from if we didn't have it already. We include that in our checklist. We also harvest the attribute data against the approved data model. So we check that to make sure that's correct. We make sure that the required attributes and key attributes are set for all categories. We fix any normalization errors that we find so that the data can load in the Teamcenter. And we provide category images. A nice feature within Teamcenter is if you have a category image, you can do like basically an image-based search. If you have the category images, it just makes it easier for finding parts. And we can also load images for each of the parts. We can provide, in step 7, description templates. You want to check to make sure in step 8 you have all your LOV lists. Step number 9, you want to make sure that you note the approved sources of where you got the data model from so people know where it came from. And then lastly, step number 10, as you check all this data, you want to basically test it out. Run your search queries, run your analytics, make sure it works properly before you move forward. When you passed all your validation errors, the last step is to create these XML files. It's a format that Teamcenter allows to load the classification data. There's 4 files that we typically produce. The first one is the item data export, which includes all the attribute data for every part. The next one is the classification data export, which is the actual category structure with all the category attributes. The next one is the attribute data export, which is a list of all the master attributes. And then lastly, it's the LOVs, which are all the LOV lists and their associated values. We produce some other types of reports just for reference purposes in Excel. Some of our customers have asked for just seeing the item numbers and the revisions. We'll typically send the category images separately. It's not part of the PLMXML, and they can load those into Teamcenter. So that's basically the types of file formats that you put into Teamcenter classification. What are some of the things that we've learned? I don't have time to go through all of these, but I'll just describe a couple of them. There's always lessons learned. Up front, you want to make sure you know all of the validation errors that can occur in Teamcenter, so they don't surprise you when you go to load the data in Teamcenter. So you want to have that list in front of you. You want to test load the data in Teamcenter. Make sure you can run all the queries that you want to be able to run. Make sure that the data governance is in place and that you can create parts the way you want to create parts, that there's enough LOV lists to keep engineers or people creating parts from typing in the wrong information. That's why you want those LOV lists in place to enforce your data governance. You want to make sure that the person that's doing the testing with you on the Teamcenter side knows how to interpret the error log and can tell you if there is an error, what exactly is wrong. And if you're not exactly sure what those error logs are, since we're a partner of Teamcenter, we recommend that you contact GTech, and they have a support email, and you can reach out to them, or you can get them on the phone, and they can help you through the process. So there's a lot of things that we've kind of learned through the process. I'm not going to go through each one of these. You can read the rest of these later when we send out the video. So kind of beginning with the end in mind, why do classification? Well, when we find a lot of our customers are moving data from different divisions, and each division have different levels of data quality, or they have different ways of describing the same thing. And when you get attributes like materials, you'll find that the same materials described 6 different ways across 5 different divisions. You want to make sure there's only one. You want to make sure they share just one commodity code list, and that there's only one set of material specs. So those are nice things that the classification project can do across these different divisions as you bring the data together and put into Teamcenter. It also helps you implement a data governance process. You just put all this effort into cleaning your legacy parts. You also want to have a governance process in place to keep that data clean for new parts going forward. So that's why you want those LOV lists. That's why you need to have required attributes so that the engineers make sure they're filling out the proper fields going forward, and you're not creating bad data going forward after you just put all this effort in your legacy data. So why do it? It helps engineers find parts. If you can make their job easier, they'll spend a lot less time looking. They won't have to create parts. You'll save money. It also helps the supply chain. They can look at commodity group by commodity group what they're buying from different suppliers, probably at different prices for the same thing, and it gives them a chance to kind of rationalize the supply base and get better pricing at the same time. So that's a huge value proposition for the supply chain, not just for engineering. You can use classification to help standardize units of measure. We had one customer that wanted to move everything to metric as part of this whole classification process, and we were able to do that. So that's another benefit. And with this attribute data, you can expose duplicate parts and near duplicate parts, and you can also prevent them from being created down the road. And lastly, and maybe most importantly, it makes Teamcenter fun to use. Now that you've got all this nice data, engineers are going to be more excited when they move to a new PLM system like Teamcenter when they have nice data that they can search. Saves them lots of time, makes them happy. So we only had 15 minutes to present this. I realize I went over. So the video will be going out, but you can join our classification community group if you're interested in these type of topics. We have blogs on our website. You can see those under our classification community group tab on our website. Like I mentioned earlier, you can visit us at the Detroit Rug on Thursday. And if you have more questions and you're not finding the answers, feel free to even email me or come visit me at the Detroit Rug on Thursday. I'll be glad to talk to you. And that's it for my presentation.
Okay, I'm looking to see if we have any questions.
So if now's the time, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. We covered a lot of material very quickly.
Okay, it does look like I'm showing a question from Andrew. Go ahead, Andrew. Andrew Rhodes, do you have a question? All right. Any others? Okay, I am showing a question here from Frank. When do you know when to use LOV lists?
LOV lists. What I recommend for LOV lists is one is you want to make sure it's typically a required attribute. And if you have a lot of data for that category, I would include an LOV list. But if you only have 2 or 3 parts in one particular category, an LOV list might not make sense, because the problem is if you use an LOV list there, you only have 3 attribute values for the engineers to pick from to create parts, and inevitably they're going to have to go to you to add another value to the list. So you want to avoid creating a bottleneck with those LOV lists when it comes to creating parts. So I recommend LOV lists, minimally you have 10 values on the LOV list that supports maybe 200 or 300 parts. Any other questions?
Yes, I am showing a question from Heidi, and it looks like her question is for screws, where you recommend different classes for metric versus Imperial. What do you enter for your metric units on the Imperial class, since metric units are required?
So if you separate the metric, if you have a separate category for metric screws as you do Imperial screws, I think that's a better practice than what I was showing you in the presentation, where if you try to combine them all in one category, you just end up with that issue with toggling between metric and Imperial. When you get an M4 in one field and you get 3 1/8 in another field. So I recommend that you separate those into 2 separate categories, and they may have different attribute profiles anyways, because they do have slightly different attributes. It just makes it a little easier to manage. It may confuse the engineers a little bit on the search side, but at least they'll be able to toggle in between and find the exact screw that they need.
Okay. And I am showing another question here from Dave. Should we do classification before or after a Teamcenter go live?
So in our experience, I recommend separating a Teamcenter go live and classification. When we've done projects, when the classification initiative is tied to the Teamcenter go live, you end up doing a lot of work in the last couple of months. You're scrambling because there's so many things that you end up realizing you need to deal with on the classification side. You need to get people to weigh in on what you want to do around certain categories and attribute profiles and LOV lists and numeric versus imperial data that end up taking more time than you anticipate. And then if you're on a go live timeline, you're obviously at risk of slowing that down. So I recommend that the classification, you start classification well ahead of the Teamcenter go live, and then you introduce it at any point in time. Ideally, you start that ahead of time, and then once it looks like it's almost done, then you move forward with your Teamcenter go live, so that then your engineers, as I mentioned, will be really pleased when they get the new Teamcenter that they have all this nice rich data to search. But I just highly recommend you start classification way ahead of it, because you're going to inevitably run into bottlenecks that will slow the process down.
Okay, I have another question here from Karen. What criteria do you use to determine what parts to classify?
So, yeah, step one in our process, the first thing you want to do is come up with a parts list. And one of the things we recommend is, if you have limited timeline or budget, that you come up with a criteria. Parts that you're most likely to share should be one of your criteria. And if you're buying parts, is there a high volume of those? Is there a big spend associated with those? That should be part of your criteria. So those are some of the criteria that I recommend. Is it something you bought in the last couple of years? Are they purchased parts? Are they parts that you can share across different businesses? Those are all good criteria for parts you want to classify. If you have certain assemblies or components that are very specific to one product that you don't have a lot of, you might not want to put a lot of effort into classifying them. If you do, maybe just a couple of attributes. But the ones that are most likely to be shared, those are the ones you want to collect the most data for and make it as easy as possible for people to share across the different divisions.
Okay, it does look like a question came in from Andrew, looking for any recommendation on a number for screws and nuts fitting that have the same part number that are in different CADs.
The screws and nuts that have the same part number, I'm not sure exactly how that can occur unless they're in two different PLM systems, because the part number is the unique item key. So I'm not sure if I'm completely understanding that question. We don't allow the same part number to be loaded into our database. So that's another type of duplicate. It's a duplicate by item key. And that happens when you're bringing multiple businesses together. And one of the things you're going to need to do is adopt one part number and come up with a new part number for the other one prior to moving forward with your classification initiative.
Okay. I'm not showing any other questions at this time.
All right. I think we're at our time limit here. As you see on the screen here, please join us at the PLM World. And if you have additional questions, feel free to reach out. You've got my email. I'll show it here one more time. Feel free to reach out. Thanks for joining the classification community group. We look forward to seeing you guys at our next meeting.